Good morning. I'm Mary Bers, and I'm here through the Oral History Project of the Nashville Bar Association. And I'm here on today, Monday, July the 31st, 2017, to interview Reverend Mr. Mike Catalano, who is with us and has had a life that is one that is for us all to remember how all the amazing things that he did. Mike, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Good morning. Before we go into your life as a lawyer and then your life as a deacon, I just wanted to ask you a few questions about your background.
Okay.
And where you grew up and all those interesting things about your early life. Where were you born and where did you grow up?
Okay. I was born in Jackson, Mississippi. My dad was from New York City, and he was in World War II, and he met my mother in Mississippi in one of the Army training camps. And when he got back from serving his country in Europe, he was in Patton's Third Army as a medic. He married my mother, and my sister was a what they call, the famous baby boomers. She was a World War II baby. My dad stayed in the Army for 20 years, and I was a Korean War baby. And so I was born in 1954 after my dad came back from Korea. I was born almost a year or 9 months after he and my mother reunited, so to speak. So, but I grew up, actually, the first few years of my life, my dad was still in the Army. I was born in 1954.
Yes.
And so, as I just said, I guess. And so until 1962, he served from 1941 to 1962. And then he retired from the Army, and he got a job at Arnold Engineering Development Center, which is the aerospace testing place down in Coffee County, Tennessee.
Near
and
Tullahoma?
So, near Tullahoma.
Mm-hmm.
And I grew up in Manchester, Tennessee.
Mm-hmm. So you grew up in that whole environment of Arnold and that.
Hey, that's correct. During the time of the big space race, AEDC, as they called it, was a pivotal player in the whole Apollo, not Mercury, but the Gemini and Apollo programs. They did a lot of the rocket and engine testing. My dad was he worked in he did administrative stuff. He was not an engineer or anything like that. So, but that's where I grew up in Manchester, Tennessee, from '62 until '72 when I graduated from high school.
So that's when you went to high school there.
Went to grammar school, junior high, and then high school there.
Okay. In high school, you did some interesting things.
Well, yeah, I know what you're. When I was a junior in high school, I had this idea that I'd like to be a congressional page in Washington, D.C. And so my sister, who was a little bit older than me, was a reporter for the local newspaper, and she basically inundated the poor Congressman Joel Evans with letters from everybody that she knew to appoint me as a congressional page, and I was appointed a congressional page and served in Washington, D.C. as a page in 1971.
So this is during the Nixon administration.
That's correct. And in fact, I was there in May of 1971. My first day, congressional pages, actually, it was interesting. When you would start your day as a congressional page at about 6:15, 6:30 in the morning when you would go to school. And the school was in the upper floors of the Library of Congress, right next to the Capitol. And so you'd go to school from 6:15 in the morning until about 10:30 in the morning, and then walk across the Capitol lawn to the House chamber where you were supposed to report for work. My first day was when there were all of these demonstrations going on about the Vietnam War, and as I was walking to the Capitol, literally there were police officers, their tear gas, you could see the tear gas smoke, and police officers were chasing demonstrators through the Capitol grounds.
Wow, they didn't mix you up with them, did they?
No. I was in a tie, and I was all just, poor little boy from Tennessee. And so I reported for duty, and I was a congressional page, and it was a very interesting time, very exciting time, and it opened up to think of me as a I'm remembering back when this would have been when I was 17 years old. My parents just basically put me on the airplane, and I flew up to Washington all by myself and went to, there was a boarding house where these little old ladies would take care, you know, they had boarding rooms,
Right.
the old-timey boarding rooms, and I took a cab to the boarding house, and I was there.
And you were independent right from the beginning.
That's true. Yes, that's my first real venture out into the world, and it was to Washington, D.C., the center of the country.
You went right to the heart of things, didn't you?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did.
Did you have any inkling of what you were going to be, that you wanted
Oh,
to be?
yes. By then, I was definitely. I mean, when I was somewhere in junior high school, I don't know why, but I had this sense that I wanted to be a lawyer. I can't pinpoint the date, but I had that sense that I wanted to be a lawyer. And sometime, I guess it was the person in high school that had more effect on me than anyone else was this teacher. He was a history teacher. His name was Alfred Fisher, and he was Jewish, and he was a little Jewish man in a sleepy Tennessee town, and he would really inspire people about our political system, about our government, and I ended up being on the debating team, and we participated in the first high school Model United Nations, and I was trying to think of all the other things. I was the editor of the school newspaper and did all that sort of stuff. And so being a congressional page was that was just part and parcel of the whole thing.
Did he ever find out that you actually became a lawyer?
Oh, sure. I went back, and he was delighted, very much so.
Yeah, I bet he was.
Yes,
I bet he
yes.
was. So when you were 17, you were off and running in Washington,
Mm-hmm.
and then at some point you must have gone to college, or maybe you just went fast forward.
No. I went to college everybody else was either going to Middle Tennessee State University or University of Tennessee, and I was trying to be independent, and I ended up going to Memphis State University in Memphis, Tennessee.
So you really got out of the Manchester area and went west. What did you major in?
I majored in political science and philosophy.
Wow, a double major.
Mm-hmm.
A double major. And did you work during college, or?
Oh, sure. I worked from the time I was 14 years old.
Really?
My mom had said that I needed to earn the first year of my college before they'd be willing to pay for the remaining years of college. And so I was working at a putt-putt golf course for a couple of years, a couple of summers, and then I worked in a drugstore, I worked in a grocery store, I worked at Carrier Air Conditioning, a second shift one summer, assembling air conditioners. And so in school, I worked at the library, basically, as a part-time job.
So you just kept on working.
Oh, yeah,
was just part of your life, wasn't it?
It is, yeah.
Yeah, it just kept on being part of your life.
It did, all the way through law school, and I mean, I have been always working in some way.
Now, during college, you had some travels, is that right?
Right. When I was in college, after I finished my first 2 years of college, I got this, well, I didn't have a car, and so I finished my sophomore year, and I was talking to my parents about them buying me a car because I'd finished 2 years and my grades were good. But I also had this idea, I don't know why I'd heard of, it's called the Junior Year Abroad Program. And Memphis State didn't offer it, but there was this independent company that offered it, and I had to check with Memphis State to make sure that they would accept the credits. Well, it turned out the program was through Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. And so my mother said, well, you have a choice. Either you can have the car, or you can spend your junior year abroad.
Yes.
And I decided to spend my junior year abroad. And so it was in 1973-74, 74-75, that I went to the University of London in London, and the program was with about 20 students, and most of them were from Georgetown. And they had professors from the London School of Economics, the University of London, Oxford, and various other universities around London to teach us at what was then, and I think still is, Birkbeck College. And so that was my junior year. But the interesting thing was they had, in addition to the first semester being at the University of London, where we studied Western European politics, history, that sort of stuff, the second semester was divided between the first half of the semester was, they focused on British politics, British history, British theater. We had a theater critic, and our assignments were to go once a week to a play in London and critique it, and then she would come back and we would talk about the play.
That was a tough course.
It was. It was just really hard. I loved it, absolutely loved it. But the second half of the course was really interesting. I went. They had the first half was Britain, the second half was Poland, and we went. At this time, Poland was still communist.
Right. Right.
And we went to the Central School of Planning and Statistics in Warsaw, and we spent a half a semester at Warsaw, and traveled all around Eastern Europe, in particular in Poland. I visited, among other places, Auschwitz concentration camp. Lots of places that other people would never think to go. I also spent my Christmas vacation, of all places, in Leningrad and Moscow.
Wow. Would you recommend junior year abroad?
Yes, yes, absolutely. At least a semester abroad when you're in college, because it is a very broadening, it's just incredible. It's just a very broadening experience, I guess is the right word.
So you've been halfway around the world before you finished college.
That's correct. Yep.
Wow.
Yep.
And did you ever go back to any of these places?
Actually, yes. We stayed, well, let me back up. When I was in London, they had like a couple. They had people that you would stay with, like exchange students, except they weren't exchange. And so we stayed with this couple. There was another student and I. His name was Rick Corkin, and the couple's name was Dick and Doreen Hoppy. I'll never forget. Anyway, they lived in North London, and so I went back in 1995.
Yeah.
And she was still there. He had died, but she was still there, and so I got to see her.
Oh, that's neat.
Which was like 20 years later.
That's neat. Did you, you obviously went on to law school. Was there any break between college and law school?
No. I came back to Memphis State in the summer of '75, and went all the way through until May of '76 when I graduated from undergraduate school. And then went directly to UT Law School and started in their summer program, and actually finished it in 2.5 years.
Wow.
So I graduated in December of '78 and took the bar in February of '79.
Wow. And so you really took an accelerated path getting through law school. You really wanted to be a lawyer.
I really wanted to be a lawyer. That's right. That's right. That's true. That's very true.
When you started out, and I bet a lot of people would be very interested in knowing what it was like for you when you were handed your degree in law, and there you were. What did you do next?
Well, like everybody else, the main thing you want to do is find a job.
Right, exactly.
And so I had applied for, and actually had applied for some jobs and not gotten them, and applied for some jobs and gotten some job offers. Ultimately, I went with something that's probably on the safer side. I got a job with what was then called, and I think it still exists, County Technical Assistance Service here in Nashville, and it is a service that it offers. It's part of the University of Tennessee and offers a broad range of services to county officials, among which is legal services, providing legal advice. I had that job for about 6 months. And the reason I got the job was a good friend of mine who was from Manchester also was one of the lawyers, and he was actually the one that hired me, Ron Fultz. But a position came open, and I can't even remember how I became aware of it, for the staff attorney to the executive secretary of the Supreme Court. It's now called the State Court Administrator.
Yes.
Then it was Cletus McWilliams.
Okay.
And so I applied for that position and got that position and started in probably November of 1979. I think it was about November.
Okay, about 1979.
Right.
Going into 1980, perhaps.
Correct. Correct. And I was there for about a year. And what I did for the Supreme Court was I was the staff attorney for Mr. McWilliams. Any questions about, I remember dealing with the payment of fees and stuff to indigent counsel.
Yes.
There were a lot of legal questions that came up with that. I also was the person who did the planning for the educational seminars for the judges, and I did 2 different seminars, did all the administrative support and stuff. But I could tell early on, and I remember Mr. McWilliams saying to me when he hired me, and he said, "No, you're not going to leave us in a year or something." And of course, at a particular time, I said, "No, I'll be here, Mr. McWilliams. You don't have to worry." Well, a position came open in the Attorney General's office, and I applied, and Mr. McWilliams gave me a hard time about it, but he let me go. At that time, it was Bill Leach, who was the Attorney General, that hired me.
Yes.
And that would have been in December 1980, and that started my long tenure at the Attorney General's office.
I was going to say, and how long were you in the state attorney's?
From 1980 to 2004, 24 years.
And during that time, you had many roles, and you did many things and had many accomplishments.
Well, I don't know about accomplishments, but I did a lot of things.
Speaking
it was
as
really
one
quite interesting.
who learned from you at the Attorney General's office, I can attest to that.
Okay.
So how did you start out at the AG's office?
Well, I was in the tax division. Jimmy Creasy was the deputy of the tax division, and there was the tax division, there was the civil division, the criminal justice division, and the transportation division, and the antitrust division. There were 5 divisions.
So
and I was the 42nd attorney in the Attorney General's office.
So it looked very, very different then.
It did. It was down in the 450 building. We called it the 450 building, which was on James Robertson Parkway, and it was probably the way lawyering was. I mean, had been for many, many years. There were the technology. When I started, there were still secretaries. My secretary at one point was Mickey Beasley, and she and Jan Connell were secretaries from the early mid-1960s. They could still do shorthand, and you could dictate. I used to dictate letters, and Mickey would take shorthand and then type it up.
And Jan was there for many years.
Yes, absolutely,
yeah.
absolutely.
And so you were working with some people who probably are still at the AG's office to this day.
Oh, sure.
Like Larry Lewis.
My best friend Larry Lewis he probably will be there until, I don't know. Well, he keeps talking about whether he's going to retire or not. He's been there 40 plus years, I think.
Golly, he's the deputy of the tax division.
That's correct.
In the AG's office. Did you stay in the tax division, or what happened next?
Oh, okay. Well, the tax division, for a period of time, I was in the Knoxville office because of my wife and going back to law school, and that would have been 1982 to 1984. But when I came back in 1984, there was a reorganization of the office, and they had a division. They had Civil Division 1 and Civil Division 2, and I had been doing some tax work, but I also done election work and constitutional law work. And so that was what really my interest was, constitutional law. And so when I got back, I had to make a choice between tax and civil, and I chose the civil division, and they made Steve Doty the deputy of the civil division. Civil Division 2 is what they called it. And Steve was only there less than maybe a year, I would say maybe a year, as the deputy. And then he left, and when he left, Mike Cody, who had become the Attorney General in 1984, made me the deputy of that division. And one of the early things I did to kind of bring about a certain camaraderie among the division was to have a Name That Division contest. So we ended up naming the division the Civil Rights and Claims Division, or the CRAC Division.
And this is vintage Mike Catalano.
That's true.
I must say that there were many contests even after that. Do you recall Mike teaching the rules of appellate procedure using Jeopardy as?
Oh yes, I did that a number of times. Both. Also, when this was a little bit later, after I was the deputy of the
Or skipping around a
that
bit.
division. Yeah,
Yeah.
you were skipping around. I was trying to think of when I taught that. That would have been probably a little bit later, but yes, I did.
I think it was in your next.
Correct.
When
My
you were in
next
your
iteration, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah, because I was deputy of that division from '85 until '87, and then I had this desire to go back to Washington D.C.
Yes.
And so there was this. The National Association of Attorneys General had started this program where they would have one or two what they called Supreme Court Fellows, and this would be like for a three-month period, and I became a Supreme Court Fellow basically in the fall of 1987. And the role of the Supreme Court Fellow was to assist the legal counsel to the National Association of Attorneys General in preparing state attorneys general for oral arguments before the U.S. Supreme Court. And so in the fall of 1987, I was in the catbird seat and got to watch basically all of the arguments before the U.S. Supreme Court. And one of the things that I brought back from that experience, and also, let me back up, I also wrote, one of the things I did, I had to have a project, and my project was I wrote an amicus brief. Michigan v. Long, I think was the name of the case. It was a criminal case, and we got 32 states, I think, to sign on the brief, and the state won the case. I can't even remember what the case was about. Isn't that awful? But anyway, when I came back, one of the things that I did was I was no longer the deputy. Mike Cody made me deputy of special projects, I think. And so one of the projects, two things I did. One was the moot court program. I started it. And two was the ethics committee and the ethics guidelines that were developed as, that was something that I didn't write them all myself, but I sort of supervised the writing of them. We broke them down into different committees and then came up with the document, and then we had an ethics committee that would answer questions that attorneys might encounter as in their roles as attorneys for the state.
And speaking as one of those lawyers, that was a real service. When there was ever an issue that arose, it was very nice to have the recourse to the ethics committee and the minds of other lawyers and who would look at this through the
one thing
rules of ethics.
One thing I just thought about is all the different litigation. In addition to all this, all the litigation. I mean, I was the reapportionment attorney in the early 1980s. I was the second with Bob Littleton in that first round of the Lockhart litigation, which was about dividing of counties. And I argued a number of times before the state Supreme Court and in federal court on redistricting cases, both in federal court, or both in, as I just said, not only in state court, but in federal court Voting Rights Act issues. And so that thread went through much of every 10 years they would come back to me. In other words, after 1980, I was the redistricting person in the 1990s and even in the 2000s, in the early 2000s when they had litigation.
Wow, so your consistency of working in the AG's office
Right,
paid off in a lot of ways.
Yeah, because once you handle a case, then you're the expert in that area.
Yeah.
Another area was defending the state's abortion regulations. That's something that we did. There's a wide variety of cases. It was fascinating, the type of stuff.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you went back to Washington a few times, not just once or twice, but a few times. You of course worked when I first met you. You were working on the tinted window cases. In Chancery Court in Davidson County.
That's correct.
And these, of course, all had constitutional issues involved.
And that was my area that I liked, was constitutional law in any shape, form, or fashion. It's one of the few places that you can practice constitutional law on a regular basis.
And as a matter of fact, later on down in your time at the Attorney General's office, you found yourself at counsel's table at the United States Supreme Court on a case.
Yeah, that was the 100-foot boundary rule, and actually we had lost that case. This was a statute that basically prohibits the distribution of campaign material within 100 feet of the entrance of a polling place on Election Day. And the Tennessee Supreme Court had struck down that law on the basis of the free speech clause of the First Amendment of the United States
Now,
Constitution.
Chancellor Kilcrease had upheld
He
the
had
law.
upheld it, but they struck it down. And Justice Fones, in fact, wrote a dissent. I remember that distinctly. And so I convinced, then it was Charles Burson, who was the Attorney General, to take a shot at an appeal, and nobody thought we had a chance. And so I remember writing the jurisdictional statement, because it went to the U.S. Supreme Court from the state Supreme Court, because there was a federal constitutional issue. That's what they ruled on. And I did this very detailed analysis of all the other states that had this law, which was virtually every state, and they took it.
Now, that was Burson v. Freeman, is that right?
That's correct,
Burson
v. Freeman.
That was the name of it. And then it was Justice Blackmun who wrote that.
That's correct. And in Burson v. Freeman, it was kind of funny. Once the case got granted, General Burson then decided it must be an interesting case, and so he decided to argue it. I had hoped to be the one to argue the case, but he was fairly new, and he wanted to argue a case in the Supreme Court. I did sit at counsel table, and I did draft the brief, although it was probably revised countless times before it was finally submitted to the court. But we did win. I think the vote was 7-2, something like that.
I think Justice Stevens wrote a dissent in that. But Justice Blackmun pretty much, I think, followed a lot of your
he said
reasoning.
there was a compelling state interest, basically,
Yes.
which is unusual. But he said on Election Day, that's so very important, and as we know, that has become an important issue about making sure that basically the polling place is a campaign-free zone.
Yes.
Is what you're talking about.
Right. And the concerns were of voter fraud, which is
Correct.
of course
Exactly.
an issue that's still very
That's correct.
very
That's right.
prominent right now, as well as voter independence.
That's correct.
And so
Coercion and all that sort of stuff. That's
so
right.
your
right.
thinking in your brief
Right.
led to a pretty significant Supreme Court opinion.
It was.
which-
That was what I was happy. We were definitely happy with that. And I got my quill pen. Anybody who's argued before the Supreme Court have been at counsel table gets a quill pen, handmade, and that's sort of a great thing.
Yes,
So.
yes. Well, plus you made sure whenever we go to vote that there is that
That's
window
correct.
there
That's
between
correct. That's right.
where we have that moment of silence, and I think they even calculated that might be about 15 seconds you've got of silence. That's what about 100
That's
feet
right.
would be.
I think that's what Justice Fones wrote in his dissent. Yeah.
Not enough time to really start from scratch, but
Correct.
enough time to decide for sure what you want to do. When you were at the Attorney General's office, and we skipped around a little bit, Mike,
Sure.
but you became the Associate Solicitor General.
Right.
Is that right?
In 1993, when Charles Burson decided to create the Office of Solicitor General, he named Mike Moore as the Solicitor General, and then myself and 2 other attorneys as Associate Solicitors General, so that we could have a very concrete review process for appellate briefs that are filed before the Tennessee Supreme Court and the federal courts of appeals, and even in certain cases in the State Court of Appeals and State Court of Criminal Appeals.
And most of us had the experience of getting briefs back that General Catalano had reviewed, and there was a lot of red on them.
Well, I actually learned more about writing appellate briefs from Mike Moore, to be honest, than anyone. What I remember about Mike is, and he passed away of,
Yes.
I think he had brain cancer, if
Yes.
I remember, a number of years ago. But Mike was he could be very brusque, but he had a heart of gold. And he taught me about writing appellate briefs is about being direct. And the sentences themselves should always be direct statements and to the point, and not to have overly complicated statements, and to break sentences down into real basic, just to be very sequential and direct with your arguments. And that probably helped me more than anything else in my writing. Even though I had been writing for years, I must say he really did.
And you, in turn, taught many of us to forget about the passive tense.
That's correct. That's what I'm talking about. Active tense. That's
Right.
exactly correct.
Right.
Because, and the other thing that I have learned was, and this was actually in my later role, which we'll talk about in a minute with my later role as the clerk of the court.
Right.
One of the things that members of the court, judges, do not like, either in judicial writing or in oral argument, is they don't like pronouns. They do not like pronouns. They want you to say who you're talking about, because when it's he and she,
Sure.
which he and she. So those are little things, but those are the type of things that you really pick up on to make things more direct.
They make a big difference, don't
Yeah.
they?
Yeah.
You also were instrumental in instituting and starting up the moot court program in the State Attorney General's office. What was that all about?
It came out of my experience in Washington, D.C., and it was with the Supreme Court Fellows Program. And the idea was that you prep somebody by having 3 experienced attorneys in that area to actually review the briefs, and you make your oral argument in a practice session before them, and they grill you. And I think most attorneys that come out of that process and then go argue the case will say more often than not that the oral argument is much easier than the moot court.
Absolutely.
Because it really, you do not, there are times when you will have a question that is asked that you know is the hard question, and you want to formulate an answer. And what moot court does is it enables you to formulate that answer. It may not be the answer that the judge likes, but you have an answer. The worst thing in the world to see, and this happens in the appellate courts on a regular basis, is what I call the deer in the headlights, where the attorney hasn't thought of that question and has no clue as to what to say. And it's usually an awkward silence, and then the judge just kind of moves on.
Yes.
And so what you want to do is to at least have an answer. It may not convince the judge, but you at least have a response of what the position in this case of the state is on a particular point.
Just as one who remembers that moot court program and process very much, it often caused those of us who were about to argue to go right back to square one and refashion our argument.
Right. And oftentimes it's the basic and simple questions. One of the things that we taught attorneys was always to, especially if you're the appellant, what are you asking the court to do? What specifically do you want the court to do? Not that we think that the legislature was wrong, but what order do you want us to put down? Because in addition to the opinion, there's always an order. And the order has to say specifically, and they have to have the authority to do. You have to tell them what they can do, and they want to know if they can do what you're asking them to.
Yes,
So,
yeah. And it seems pretty obvious, doesn't it?
It does.
Unless you're actually arguing, and then you need
Correct.
somebody to remind you
Correct.
to do that.
Correct, exactly.
That made a big difference for a lot of us in the Attorney General's office, and it gave a lot of us great confidence when we actually gave our arguments, that we knew that we were on the right track and that it had been fully vetted before we went out the door. And when the argument would be over, we would think, well, they never got to the hard questions. Mike, there's so much that you did in the AG's office, but I want to move on and talk to you about the next phase in your professional life. We were very sad when you left the Attorney General's office, and a lot of us wondered how we'd ever get on without you there.
Nobody's irreplaceable.
But
Not even the Pope.
but you went on and you became the clerk of the appellate courts. And
Right.
What year was that?
2004. Up until the clerk of the court has always existed from 1796 all the way to the present. But from 1796 until 1993, the clerk of the court they had one clerk in each of the 3 grand divisions, Nashville, Knoxville, and Jackson. In 1993, Riley Anderson, then Chief Justice, had the National Center for State Courts do a study about modernization of the courts, and one of the things that the study suggested was to consolidate the clerk's office into a single clerk. And so Cecil Croson was the first one from 1993 to 2004, and then the clerk is appointed by the Supreme Court for a 6-year term. And so when he decided to retire, I put my name in the hat and was fortunate enough to be selected.
Now, even before you became clerk of the courts, there was one Halloween, I believe, when when the future clerk of the courts had a particular costume. Would you tell us about that?
Well, now I'm trying to remember which costume.
Oh,
was
my
the Tin
goodness,
Man?
there's
Are you
more
talking
than
about
one.
the Tin Man?
Well, and there was also the gorilla.
Oh, yeah. We used to have, the Civil Rights and Claims Division would have Halloween parties, and yes, there was one year where I was the Tin Man, and we had a whole, I had the silver makeup on and the whole Tin Man thing. But then there was another year that I was a gorilla. And I can remember Jimmy Creasy one year, you probably don't know about this one, dressing up as a pumpkin in tights, which was very interesting.
The visual for that is amazing.
Yeah, you have to think about that one. So.
Now, I think the year of the gorilla was also the year that you had a little red Miata. Was that correct?
Oh, probably.
Was that also the year that you drove to work in the gorilla suit?
No, I didn't. No, I didn't drive to work in a gorilla suit.
Okay.
So
that was just a bad, a terrible, false
rumor.
False
rumor, yes.
False news.
That's correct.
Well, you became clerk of the appellate courts at a very interesting time.
Yeah, and actually one of the reasons, I don't say this was the reason, but I actually knew Chief Justice Strwoda, who was the Chief Justice at the time. And it goes, my history with Chief Justice Strwoda goes all the way back to 1980, when he was on the Court of Appeals and I was working as a staff attorney for the Executive Secretary of the Supreme Court. Joe Henry, who was then on the Supreme Court, died of a heart attack while jogging on the track at Pulaski High School. I can't remember why I remember that, but that's what I remember.
Time.
And so anyway, Justice Strwoda, Lamar Alexander appointed George Brown, the first African American to serve on the Supreme Court. But Justice Strwoda, he ran as a Republican, and Justice Strwoda was then on the Court of Appeals, and he ran. When he ran, I got involved in his campaign and actually drove him around Middle Tennessee to some places I knew. And, you know, we went to radio stations and we went to rallies and all kinds of stuff. And so he sort of knew me from then. And then when I started appearing before the court, when he was on the court, he knew me from then, from all the different times I appeared before him in court. And so when I applied for the position, he was the Chief Justice, and I think he just decided I was the person for the position.
You were the person for the job.
Yeah.
You and Justice Strwoda also had in common your love of running.
That's correct, actually. Yeah, that comes from Mike Cody, who was the Attorney General, and Mike ran probably 15 or 20 Boston marathons. He was a really fast runner. Justice Strwoda he'd run a half marathon, and I did run a half marathon with him once, but back many years ago. But then with Mike Cody in the Attorney General's office, I ran a lot. I was running marathons probably on a regular basis. I still run half marathons, but I'm getting a little too old for the marathons.
Wow.
But I ran, I think, 4 Bostons.
Wow. So you've run for many years.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And I think Cecil Croson also.
Yes, I think that's right.
Was a runner as well.
That's
so
right.
That might be like a job requirement.
So anyway, the clerk of the court at that time, one of the things that they wanted was modernization, some more modernization in technology, and so I did a number of things as the clerk of the court in the technology area, including a new case management system that we pushed onto the internet, and so that people could see the case histories, the orders, and when I left, that was the last thing I did, and then in 2013, I think, is when it went live. And they're still working, I believe, on e-filing as being another component.
But that was from the beginning an interest of the justices.
And like, for example, the oral arguments are now online, and that's something that we did. That was we first off recorded the oral arguments had always been recorded on cassette tapes.
Sure.
And what we did was we moved it from being recorded on cassette tapes, which is from the 1960s, to posting them online and being available for people, along with the oral argument calendars, all that sort of stuff, putting everything online, available.
And there would also be the orders of the court also.
That's correct.
That would be online.
That's right.
As
all
well.
of that stuff.
Yeah, that was a big difference. It made a huge difference to have those things available. You also were very instrumental, not just instrumental, but one of the drivers of the development of I believe it's called the Justice Museum, or
the Tennessee Judiciary
Thank
Museum.
you very much.
Yes,
That's
yes,
what
yes.
it is.
In 2012, there was the 75th anniversary of the dedication of the Supreme Court building, and Judge Andy Bennett, who had been in the Attorney General's office and was now on the Court of Appeals, and I came up with this idea of having a celebration and creating a museum. And actually, it goes all the way back to Justice Barker. He had talked about, Justice Mickey Barker, about they had a museum down at the Louisiana Supreme Court. And I'd actually been down there at one of the meetings and saw the museum. And so we decided to do the museum, but in addition to the museum and the celebration and the opening of the museum, because it was all of this, we knew that all this had to be, we couldn't be, well, it wasn't government funded. We got money from different foundations like the Frist Foundation to do this. And so one of the big things that we did for the celebration was, and this was my idea, yeah, this was my idea, was the 1796 Constitution, the original Constitution of Tennessee, had never been on public display to my knowledge. And so we talked to the people over at Library and Archives, the State Library and Archives, about, it was in a vault, and we asked whether we could put it on display.
Yes.
And the long story short is they agreed to have it put on display at the Supreme Court building. And so this would have been in 2013 or no, it was 2012, excuse me, 2012, in December of 2012, that we actually put the original Constitution on display. Now, the funny story goes, do we have time for the funny story?
Oh, we do. We do.
The funny story goes that when I was working all this out, I mean, we're talking about the original Constitution. It was signed by, among other people, Andrew Jackson.
Wow. And there's only one in existence.
There's only one. There's only one in existence. And so I'm talking with the Library and Archives people, and they're saying, yeah, I mean, everybody's agreeing that we can do this for a week. And they said, but you need to talk to they had an umbrella insurance policy for all of their archival documents, and that we would need to talk to the legal counsel for the insurance company that had that umbrella policy. And so I called this guy up in Washington, D.C. with this insurance. This is in addition to the state coverage. And I said, we have some articles from the State Library and Archives that we'd like to put on display for the 75th anniversary of the celebration of the Supreme Court building. And the guy said, oh, I don't think it'll be any problem, but, you know, unless it's something like your original Constitution. And I said, well, guess what? We want to put the original Constitution on display. And when I said that, I'll never forget, there was an audible gasp on the other side. And he didn't say anything for a couple of seconds. He just he couldn't believe. And he said, could you say that again? And I said, yes. And he said, and then it was like, oh boy, here was a big hurdle, because all of a sudden we weren't going to be able to do this.
Yeah.
And he said they were adamant that the only way that this could be done is if we had some sort of security guard in the room 24/7. And so what we ultimately did was we went to the Tennessee Highway Patrol and we said, can you all do this? Now, you're going to have somebody there at 2 o'clock in the morning. And they said, you pay us overtime, we'll be there. We'll be glad to be there. And so for that whole week, while the Constitution was there, they had an honor guard when it was open to the public, which was really neat. But then they had a trooper in that room guarding it.
Yeah. So the concern of the insurance company was that somebody would.
Yeah. And we had to have. I mean, the building, that room had to have all this security stuff on it. You know, motion detectors, cameras, and all this stuff. And I remember when we brought it. We brought the Constitution from the Supreme Court, from the Library and Archives Supreme Court building.
Something.
Yeah. And when we took it out. We put on the little white gloves and we get it all out and laid it out. Now, we also had it scanned And so what we have now in the Supreme Court building is an extremely high-resolution digital scan of that.
Yeah, but you know what, Mike? Aren't you glad? Isn't that something to be really proud of
Oh,
in
absolutely,
your professional
absolutely.
life?
Well, and I
that
was a
you made
constitutional,
Sure.
I was a constitutional lawyer, and to have the Constitution on display. And we displayed the 1796, the 1835, and the 1870 constitutions,
Wow,
all three.
Of those.
And they still are, the front pages of all three are still on display.
That's amazing. That's a huge, huge
And
gift.
what we did in addition to that was when we because of the Frist Foundation grant, we have all these different cases, like car wreck cases, a lady that was charged with poisoning her husband, and all these things, bottles of poison and everything. We have lesson plans for groups that want to bring their schools to the museum to go over, and we've posted those online on the Tennessee Judiciary Museum website. And so that way, and we have, I can't remember, it's not a high traffic museum, but it is making people more aware of the court system.
Absolutely.
And how it works.
Sure, and for kids coming.
And we give tours. I mean, when I was the clerk of the court, I can't remember how many tours a year we would give, but it would be into the dozens of tours to leadership groups, school groups, anybody that wanted a tour. And I know Judge Bennett does it, and then the present clerk does it also.
Well, I think that was a real gift. That's a real good gift to the state to have.
It was, and it was great. It was probably, of all the things that I did as the clerk, that was probably my favorite.
Wow, it must have been something when they opened up the box and there was the original 1796 Constitution.
Well, I hate to tell you this is something that just, I can't believe they did this. But the 1796 Constitution, first off, was written on both sides. It was on one side, on the other.
Really?
Double-sided. And
economical. Uh-oh.
Sometime in the we can't figure out exactly when, the archivist could tell us exactly when. Sometime in the 1940s, somebody in the Library and Archives had this idea to preserve the Constitution. They had it laminated.
Oh, no.
And I'm like, you're kidding. No, it's laminated.
Oh, my goodness.
It's a special lamination, but it's still laminated.
It's still laminated. Oh, my goodness. And probably they probably didn't advise any insurance company before they did that either.
Well, that was probably before they had it insured in the 1940s.
Probably so.
Okay.
There's so much more I want to ask you about.
I know.
But you've been very involved also in the Nashville Bar Association, and
I was the chair of the appellate practice committee for on different times over the years, and helped to put on appellate practice CLE programs, and we would do this appellate practice CLEs where we would do pretend mock oral arguments, and we would have, I love this because we would have the good attorney, bad attorney. What I mean by good attorney is not good attorney in terms of the way you're supposed to argue cases, and then bad attorney the way you're not supposed to argue cases.
I thought you meant like red shirts and blue shirts.
No. And I remember I remember since I was the chair of the committee, I got to be the bad attorney, and so I got to do all these terrible things that attorneys, like, hi, judge, how are you doing? Blah, 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 and all that stuff. And so that was one of the things that we did. Also helped with the appellate practice manual. I was one of the editors along with Don Caparella, and I'm trying to remember.
Mary Schaffner, was she?
No, it was Trey. I can't remember Trey's name now. Isn't that terrible? From the Supreme Court. He's one of the staff attorneys over at the Supreme Court. But anyway, we were we would revise that periodically.
Sure.
And so that was one thing. I was also on the board of directors for, is it a 3-year term? Yeah, back in the 2000s, along with, I worked on some projects with Patsy's husband, Ross.
Ross, right. I mean, you speak of Patsy, you're
Right,
speaking
Patsy
about Judge
Cottrell.
Patsy
I'm sorry.
Cottrell.
Yeah, forget.
Right,
Okay.
right, yeah.
So, but yeah, I was pretty active in the Bar Association.
And you were also inducted into the Nashville Bar Foundation as well.
Right,
So you've been very active in the bar.
Right.
in addition to all
Yep.
your activities with the AG's office and the court of and the appellate courts.
Right,
as
and it was
well.
also, when I was in the appellate courts, I was a member of the National Appellate Court Clerks Conference, and I think I was chair of one of the committees. I was trying to remember which committee it was. It's been so long.
Mike, you have in your professional life, there's never been a dull moment. You were always active, and you were always not only the advocate yourself, but you were also the teacher of other people to be advocates.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
did that so skillfully,
Absolutely.
and so many of
Absolutely.
us benefited from it.
Well, thank you.
Then you
for all
had
those
a
kind words.
90-degree turn in your life.
Well, I don't know what degree turn it is, but somewhere in the, just very quickly, I was married right in law school, and her name was Peggy Nance, and we were married for a number of years, and then divorced, no kids, and then in the early 1990s, mid to early 1990s, I had a conversion to Catholicism, and at one point thought about becoming a priest.
Yes.
This was when I was single, and didn't, and glad I didn't, because I met and married my wife Janet, and
you have
then
two
in
beautiful daughters.
2002 and 2003 we adopted two little girls from China who are now juniors at Father Ryan High School.
Wow. And learning to drive,
And so,
I understand.
right, learning to drive. But as part of that, one of the things that happened to me during this, my deepening of my faith, is that around 2008, I guess it was, I felt a call to become a deacon in the Catholic Church, which is not exactly the same as a priest, but the way we put it is a deacon can, they can preach, they can baptize, they can marry, and they can bury. They can do a lot of the things that priests do. They can't do everything.
But they can counsel also.
Correct. Yeah, spiritual direction is what I call it, or what it's called. And so it was. I went 2 nights a week at Aquinas College for 4 years, and then was ordained as a deacon in 2014. And at that time, I wasn't sure. A lot of deacons. A lot of people who are deacons are also keep their full-time jobs, which I can't imagine trying to do that. So when I turned 60 around that time, and decided to at least explore the possibility with the priest at St. Henry Church, Catholic churches here in Nashville, and Father Mike Johnston, who actually is now the administrator of the Diocese of Nashville. Our bishop has passed away, and until Pope Francis appoints a new bishop, he's the administrator. He's like the interim head.
Yes.
So, but anyway, he agreed. I asked him. I said, "Well, could I go full time? I could retire and go full time as a deacon." And he said yes, and the rest is history. I retired from the state as the clerk of the court on June 3rd, 2014, and I was ordained June 9th, 2014.
All in a week's time.
And it's a radical change.
Yes.
It is a big, big change. And why did I do it? I don't know. I think it's a call. I had been dealing with rules and regulations all my life, and I felt like that this is where I was called to be with people in what they call the sacred moments of people's lives, whether it's a baptism, or whether it's a marriage, a wedding, whether it's giving people spiritual direction, dealing with the sort of the painful moments of their lives and trying to sort things out in their life, or whether it's a funeral. I mean, I had a baptism of 2 little boys about 2 weeks ago, and then I buried a lady this weekend. And so it's quite radical change, and very different. I went from rules and laws to grace and mercy.
Wow,
basically.
That's a huge change.
It is.
You were dealing with people's lives all along. When you think about it,
yeah, you do
in a different sort of way as a lawyer. There have been a number of lawyers who've also found calls to the ministry in some form or fashion, and so there seems to be some avenue.
Well, you had asked the question in the materials, is there a thread here? And that's one that I'm going to have to ponder, because it is a pretty abrupt change.
Yes.
Most lawyers don't do anything quite like this. I think.
Do you miss the practice of law?
No.
Or working with the appellate courts and
No.
yeah.
No. I don't know how to explain it other than no. You would think I would, but I don't.
Yeah, you've kept a lot of friends.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Over those years.
I like to reminisce and stuff, but I could not practice law right now. What I mean is I would be incapable of practicing law because I've been away from it for 3 years. And you know how the law is, it's not something that's static, it's like a stream that keeps moving.
Right.
And what I knew from, I mean, there's a certain fabric to the law, but there's so many changes that have occurred, I would not feel comfortable at all.
Yeah, but you've started an incredibly different life, a different, as you say, a different focus in your life with becoming a deacon.
And it's full time. That's the other thing.
And it's full time.
It's very flexible in terms of the time because I'm oftentimes, as we'll say, I'm on the altar this weekend or whatever, you know.
Right.
And so my weekends are oftentimes taken up with church work, and so I take off during the week.
And you have two beautiful little girls.
Right.
They're not little girls anymore.
No, they're not.
I think of them as little girls.
Yep.
But they are pretty much on their way to being grown up.
That's right. My life has been different. I'll say that. Most people, when they look at me and they look at one of my daughters, the first thing they notice is the daughter is Chinese, and then the second thing they think is, are you the grandfather or are you the father?
When we start, Mike, when we...
It's just reality, folks. They keep us young, I'll say that. I took one of them on a driving lesson, the one who doesn't want to drive, and I made her go out and take a driving lesson, and I had a beer afterwards.
Yes.
Because, man, Lord...
the driving lesson.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Well, no, I was gonna say to you, when we started out, we were talking about your growing up in Manchester and your experiences in high school, and I asked you at one point whether or not you had any thought of becoming a lawyer, and that's how we started out. And gosh, the way we've ended, here you are as a deacon in the Catholic Church. Looking back, did you have any idea of how your life would turn out to be?
No. You know, in spiritual direction, one of the things we talk about is that I don't like to give spiritual direction to anybody who's under 40 because they really haven't lived life and they haven't bumped into life yet. But what they say is that, you know, we spend the first half of our lives writing the text of our lives. And then we spend the second half of our lives commenting on the text that we wrote. And that's what we're doing right now, is we're commenting on the text.
Right.
And it's everything is, I mean, this is my faith, but I really truly believe that everything is, that God is love, and that everything is born out of either love or fear. And that decisions that we make on every daily basis is, am I doing this out of love or out of fear? And that's what my job is to help people to see in the pain and suffering there is love. I can't fix their situations, and that we're all called to love in all that we do, no matter who we are, no matter where we are. And it's quite that simple.
And that includes being a lawyer.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, especially. Whether you're a lawyer for the state or whether you're a lawyer for a criminal defendant.
That's a beautiful...
Doesn't matter.
That's a very deep and heavy thought. That's a gift to the rest of us to remember also. Mike, you are an amazing person.
I appreciate it.
It's been my honor and privilege to
I sometimes feel like Forrest Gump. I've been in interesting places over the time, over numbers. Who can say that they've been to the Great Wall of China? Who can say that they have seen Lenin in his tomb? I mean, I can go down the list of these places I've seen or places I've been and done. That's just quite remarkable, and I just happen to be in the right place at the right time.
At the right time. Well, and plus, I think that there's been an inclination to be in those places as well. That's true. Mike, it's been an honor to interview you. And one more time, I can say that you are still the teacher. And I, for one, am still the person learning from you.
Okay.
Thank you so very much
Well, thank you.
for your time, and I hope that all the people who hear this feel as inspired by you as I do.
Well, thanks.
Thanks.
Well, did we totally